students, this video is about aerobic cellular respiration. By the end of this video, we should be able to describe how organic molecules are converted into usable forms of energy in cellular respiration when oxygen is present. The next video is about what happens when oxygen is not present. So first, let's just define cellular respiration. So it's the process where plants and animals convert food molecules into a usable form of energy in the form of ATP in a controlled process. So if we break down this word, we can kind of see what it means. Cellular, having to do with the cell, and then respiration. We normally think about respiration on a macro level with like breathing as respiration, and that process is directly tied to cellular respiration. In fact, we can answer a lot of really important questions about our bodies as a whole by looking at cellular respiration. Specifically, we can answer things like, why do we have to eat? Why do we have to breathe or respire? Why do we need blood? We can look at a lot more questions than just these three, but I want you to keep these three questions in the back of your mind as we talk about the cellular process so we can connect it to ourselves as a big whole as well. Okay, so first I'm going to define food, because we know that cellular respiration is breaking down food in a process to get energy in a controlled way. So food has to be two things. First, it has to be something that we can break down, that we can use as building blocks, that we can have those macromolecules, break them into their monomers, put them together into something new. It also needs to be able to be converted to glucose or something else that's going to allow us to make ATP energy for cells during cellular respiration. To give some background about cellular respiration, I want us to start by looking at the chemistry. So our equation for cellular respiration is C6H12O6, good old glucose, plus 6 oxygens, and we're going to get out of it 6 carbon dioxides, 6 waters, and most importantly, about 36 ATP molecules. So this is actually a combustion reaction. Combustion, you get the idea of burning, large amounts of energy being produced, which is what cellular respiration is. Except for if combustion just happens, you're going to burn up your cells, which is not what we want. So here we see if we just have these things and put them together, get this explosive release of heat. Instead, with cellular respiration, we're going to try to take things and really slowly change them so we can pull all of that energy out and use that energy, but in a form that's not going to explode our cells. That form is ATP. So ATP stands for adenine triphosphate. It is related to adenine diphosphate. Tri meaning 3, di meaning 2. So if we look at this molecule right here, we're going to see some very similar things to our macromolecules. First, notice we've got some nitrogen and carbons, we've got hydrogens, we've got oxygens, we've got some phosphorus molecules here. So this looks really, really similar to a nucleotide, and it's very closely related. We have these 3 phosphate groups. When there's 3 phosphate groups all put together, that's kind of like a charged battery. That is a form of energy that the cell is able to use for things that cells do, like building new things, or active transport, or making proteins, or any of those things that cells do are going to require ATP, this usable form of energy. When the cell is going to use ATP, it's going to break the bond between one of those phosphate groups, so you're left with ADP, adenine di, or 2 phosphates left over, and when the bonds rearrange, energy is released. ATP is kind of like the uncharged battery. So the process of cellular respiration basically is just this whole big thing that allows a phosphate group to be added to ADP, so ATP is formed. There's some things that we're going to see when we talk a little bit more about this process. Electron carrier molecules. There's just a couple things we want to keep in the back of our minds as we look forward. The first thing is if we're talking about hydrogen, hydrogen is a special element. It only has 1 proton and 1 electron. And so when we break hydrogen, we're going to end up with proton and electron as separate things. And so you'll see where those come in when we have our electron carriers. So I like the analogy of an electron carrier, kind of like a taxi. Basically all it does is it pulls in some electrons, goes to another place, lets out the electrons. In that process though, if we're looking at NAD+, okay, this plus means that there is an extra proton there. So if we add an electron, that's where we get the NADH, because we just made hydrogen again, because we had a proton and then we added on an electron. So that's where NADH and NAD+, the only difference between those is just 1 added electron. So then we can bring this thing over, bring it to a new place, and drop it off. The same thing is true for FAD and FADH2. FAD is like the empty taxi, FADH2 is the full taxi. So those are the electron carriers. When I talk about those, that's what we mean. Last thing I want to talk about before we dive into this process is where it happens. So all of this is occurring within cells, and a lot of it's going to occur within the cytoplasm or the cytosol, the like gooey part of the cell. But a lot of it is also going to occur in this super important and really fascinating organelle. So mitochondria is an organelle that's highly conserved. A lot of different organisms have it, but it's special in that it has some of its own DNA, it has its own ribosomes. It like really talks a lot about the beginning of life when we look at it, but it's got some important parts that we want to know. First, there's this outer membrane, and then on the inside there's going to be all this folds of inner membrane. Those folds are called cristae. On the inside of that inner membrane, there's this space that we call the matrix. And in between the inner membrane and the outer membrane is the inner membrane space. So when I talk about those, that is where I'm talking about. So with that, I want to dive into the process. I want to briefly talk about the three big steps that occur during cell respiration. First, we're going to have glycolysis. It occurs in the cytoplasm. Then after that, we're going to go into the mitochondria where the Krebs cycle happens and the electron transport chain happens. First, glycolysis. So glycolysis is basically going to take our glucose molecule and it's going to break it into two, and those two halves are called pyruvate. But there's some steps in doing so. First, it requires an input of energy. That input of energy allows the first break to occur. Then there's going to be some enzymes that come and stabilize these reactions multiple times and grab some electrons from it. So here we see our charged electron carriers, two of them. Then we're going to make a little bit of ATP in that process. So now we've got a net gain of 0 ATP. Finally, we're going to add in some water, and 2 more ATPs are going to be made. So overall, this process required 2 ATPs to be put in, but then it made 4 total. So it is a net of 2 ATPs and 2 NADPHs. That's a tiny bit of energy, but that'll be an important thing in going forward. So glycolysis occurs there. Next, we have the Krebs cycle. So during the Krebs cycle, that pyruvate that was just made is going to enter the mitochondria. There's this first sort of reaction that occurs in between, and then we're going to enter this cycle. So with cycles, it means the same thing is going to start and it's going to go around, and the same thing is going to end. And so you're seeing a lot of things moving around, but basically all that's happening here is this pyruvate is being broken into bits slowly. And as it's broken into bits, there's going to be some carbon dioxide that's released, but there's also going to be these electron carriers that are charged up with electrons. The important things that occur during the Krebs cycle is that all of those carbons from our glucose are going to be released as carbon dioxide. So all we're left with is these charged electron carriers and a tiny bit more energy. So what do we do with those charged electron carriers? Well, they're going to go to our last step, which is where most of the energy is made. Almost all the ATP is made in the electron transport chain. Here's how it works. There's going to be different proteins that have different amounts of like for electrons. So those that are the most strongly liking electrons are going to occur at the end, and those that like them less occur at the beginning. So here we have our electron carriers are going to come, and they're going to donate their electrons to these proteins. As those proteins hold on to electrons, they're going to take some protons and they're going to pump them over to the inner membrane space. Then that electron is going to go to the next protein, which is a little bit more electronegative, holding it a little closer, and another proton is pumped into the inner membrane space. Then it goes to the next one, which is held a little bit closer, and another proton is pumped over into the inner membrane space. At the very end, there's going to be oxygen. So oxygen is super electronegative. It just really likes electrons. So that oxygen is going to hold on to the electron the closest to the point that it's going to create water. So it's going to hold on to those, create water. Water will be released from this process. But every single time these electrons move place to place, protons are building up in the inner membrane space. So here we have a whole bunch of positively charged ions all on one side, and they really want to diffuse and equalize themselves. So they are going to go through this other protein called ATP synthase, also right there. As these protons come through to try to equalize this concentration gradient, ATP synthase spins, and in doing so, it's able to take a phosphate group and an ADP, put them together into that charged ATP that we really want from this whole process. Okay, very quickly our different steps. We had glycolysis, where glucose was broken in half and a very small amount of ATP was made, and that occurs in the cytoplasm. Then we entered the mitochondria, where the Krebs cycle produced all the carbon dioxide, a very small amount of ATP was made, but the electron carriers were charged up. And then we have the electron transport chain. Oxygen is required at the end so it can hold on to those electrons. If oxygen isn't there, the whole process won't work. Water is produced as waste, and then we have the majority of our ATP made, which we can call oxidative phosphorylation, if you want to get fancy with terms. Very briefly, I want to talk a tiny bit more about where this is occurring in the mitochondria to put it back into context. So our Krebs cycle is going to occur on the inside here, in the matrix. All of these these little folds, they're going to increase surface area because all of the electron transport chain requires a membrane in between. And as these electrons get passed within this membrane, the protons are going to be pumped into this little space here, the inner membrane space. Then when those protons flow back through into the matrix, that's when the majority of the ATP is actually made. Super interesting to keep in the back of your mind for later, mitochondria do have their own circular DNA and their own ribosomes. We'll talk about what 70S means a little bit later. Okay, so if we think back to these questions that we had, why do we have to eat? We can answer that because of cellular respiration. So we do need those building blocks, but more importantly, we have to eat for energy from cellular respiration. Why do we have to breathe? Well, in order to do oxidative phosphorylation and make most of our ATP, we have to do cellular respiration. So we have to breathe for cellular respiration. Why do we need blood? Well, cellular respiration happens in every single cell that we have, and so our blood is going to move that food around, it's going to move that oxygen around, it's going to get rid of those waste products. It's also connected to cellular respiration. So this process is occurring at the small cell level, also helps to explain a lot that's going on in our body as a whole. So I hope that helps to introduce the idea of cellular respiration. Write down lots of questions so we can talk about it.